Tonight, trying to get back on track after an anti-tariff ad derails trade talk.
When the world's largest economy declared a trade war on its closest ally, few could have imagined how it would end. In early 2018, the White House, seeking to bring jobs back home and demonstrate the strength of the American industrial sector, imposed 25% tariffs on imports of trucks and auto parts from Canada. This was supposed to be a show of force, a signal to anyone who dared to challenge Washington. But within a few months, this move backfired,
increasing existing tariffs on Canada by 10%. CTV's Judy Trin is with Mark Carney and has more on his response and what Canada's Business Council is saying about the tactics at play in this trade war.
On those who initiated it. At the time, it seemed that Canada would not be able to withstand the blow. Hundreds of thousands of jobs depended on American supplies, and nearly 3/4 of exports went to the United States. Economists predicted a recession and businesses prepared for layoffs. But what happened next became a real lesson for the whole world. Instead of giving up, Canada used the pressure as a catalyst for change. The government in Ottawa did not play by someone else's rules. It developed its own strategy, quietly without loud statements. While American officials were assuring everyone that tariffs are making America great again, Canadian engineers and economists were laying the foundation for a new industrial era. The country began investing in high-tech manufacturing, developing the electric vehicle and battery sector, and signing trade agreements with Asia and Europe. The irony was that the blow intended for Canada hurt American companies the most. Since the auto industries of the two countries were closely linked, tariffs on Canadian components led to price increases within the U.S.
Well, Canada lied. I mean, what they did was terrible. They made up a fake statement by President Reagan.
Factories in Detroit and Ohio faced a shortage of parts, car prices rose, and consumers paid for it out of their own pockets. What was supposed to be a show of strength turned into an economic boomerang. Meanwhile, quiet but profound changes were taking place in Canada. New investments, energy projects, agreements with Indonesia and European partners, all of this strengthened the country, making it less dependent on the American market. By the time the White House realized that pressure would not achieve anything, the Canadian economy was already moving forward, more diversified, sustainable, and technologically advanced than ever before. Today, analysts call this period a turning point, the moment when Canada transformed from a dependent partner into an independent player in the global economy. The irony is that it was Washington's aggressive policy that triggered this transformation. How did a country under economic pressure manage to turn a crisis into an opportunity? Why did strategic restraint prove stronger than force? And how did a trade war conceived as an act of humiliation end up completely rebalancing power on the continent? This is a story about how an attempt to subjugate a neighbor led to the opposite result.
Forward, and to have every sector, every province, every premier kind of weighing in on this, I don't see that behavior in the United States.
About how Canada used tariffs not as a blow, but as an engine of change. And about why today it is Canada, and not its southern ally, that is becoming a symbol of the new independent economy of the 21st century. When the White House announced in 2018 that it would impose 25% tariffs on imports of medium and heavy trucks from Canada, the world saw it as the beginning of a new chapter in North American economic history. The official goal was simple: to protect American manufacturers and bring back jobs that had gone overseas. However, behind these lofty slogans lay a much tougher strategy.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Washington sought not only to strengthen its own industrial sector, but also to test the strength of its allies, especially those who felt too secure under the wing of the U.S. Canada, whose economy was 3/4 dependent on the American market, seemed the ideal target for a show of force. In the first days after the tariffs were announced, the mood on the financial markets was nervous. The Canadian dollar fell sharply, and analysts predicted a decline in the automotive and steel industries. Some media outlets wrote that Canada is on its knees, and American business circles made smug statements about the imminent return of control over the continent. But as it turned out later, it was at this very moment that Ottawa began to develop solutions that completely changed the course of the confrontation. A closed working group of economists, engineers, and diplomats was created within the Canadian government, whose task was not simply to respond with mirror measures, but to use the crisis as a springboard to revamp the country's entire economic model. At the time, few believed that the country would be able to withstand the blow. More than half of the components for Canadian car factories were supplied from the U.S.
that will benefit Canadian workers and their businesses. Nous sommes réunis ici à un moment à la fois crucial et rempli d'opportunités. Le monde est devenu plus dangereux et divisé.
And any delay threatened to halt production. However, the Canadians took an unconventional approach. Instead of rushing to cut costs, they increased investment in key industries. The government launched a temporary $8 billion fund to support auto parts manufacturers and develop domestic engineering. Part of these funds was used to accelerate the introduction of automation technologies and to create new production lines capable of manufacturing parts that had previously been purchased in America. Many considered these steps to be reckless. American experts sarcastically noted that Canada was trying to build an airplane on the fly. However, after just a few months, it became clear that the focus on technological development was the right move. Canadian factories began to produce more of their own components than ever before. The electric transport sector grew particularly rapidly. The first large battery module manufacturing plants appeared in Ontario and Quebec, some of which soon began exporting to Europe. Meanwhile, the United States faced an unexpected problem. Tariffs designed to weaken Canada hit American companies themselves.
L'ordre mondial est revenu. Et même si le Canada a prospéré dans ce système, nous savons que la nostalgie n'est pas une stratégie. C'est pourquoi nous traçons une nouvelle voie à suivre pour notre pays.
For whom their northern neighbor remained the main supplier of parts. Production chains that had been built up over decades began to collapse. American car companies were forced to raise car prices, and consumers reacted immediately. Demand began to fall. One of Washington's leading economists acknowledged that the mechanism of interdependence proved to be stronger than expected. For Canada, this was a moment of truth. For the first time in a long time, the country faced serious external pressure and not only withstood it, but also used it to its advantage. While Washington expected weakness and concessions, Ottawa demonstrated confidence and strategic calm. Within a few weeks, negotiations were held with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea to discuss new export opportunities. Some agreements were concluded in record time, just 3 months, which is almost unprecedented in international trade. At the same time, Canadian diplomacy launched an active information campaign. Articles appeared in the media about Canada's new independence and the northern response to tariffs. According to unofficial data, the government used the crisis to strengthen national identity and confidence in domestic production. Approval ratings for the government's actions rose, and the population began to perceive the trade war not as a threat, but as a chance to prove its independence. For the first time in many years, Canada began to talk about the need to break away from American influence and build its own economic path. Despite outward composure, the situation remained tense. Some industries did suffer losses. Steel and aluminum exports fell by almost 15%, and some companies temporarily suspended operations. But unlike in previous crises, the government did not allow panic to set in.
On November 4th, our government will table the first federal budget, our first federal budget. And that'll be our plan to protect our communities, our borders, our way of life. Our plan to build a stronger economy where everyone has a chance to get ahead. And our plan to empower Canadians with new opportunities, better careers, and a lower cost of living. Central to those missions,
instead of survival subsidies, companies receive support for modernization, re-equipment, and entry into new markets. Export credit programs enabled dozens of medium-sized enterprises to start selling in South America and Asia. By the middle of the following year, it became clear that Canada's economy had not collapsed, but on the contrary, had begun to restructure itself into a more sustainable structure. Tariffs, intended as a tool of pressure, turned into a point of growth. Experts noted that the effect of the American measures was the opposite of what was intended. Canada's dependence on the U.S. decreased and its export geography expanded significantly. At this time, the situation in the U.S. was changing for the worse. Manufacturers complained about a shortage of components, and governors of industrial states demanded a review of tariff policy. Against the backdrop of slowing growth and rising domestic car prices, voices began to be heard calling for a rethink of the approach to our northern neighbor. Even the White House began to acknowledge the trade pressure had produced unexpected results, but it was already difficult to change course. The confrontation had become a political symbol. Meanwhile, Canada was steadily strengthening its position. The authorities launched a large-scale program to develop renewable energy in order to reduce dependence on energy imports.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
And also began negotiations on the creation of joint technology clusters with European partners. As a result, by the end of 2020, investment in Canadian industry had grown by almost a third. International agencies, which had previously predicted a decline for the country, began to talk about the Canadian phenomenon, an example of how strategic restraint can turn sanctions against their initiator. Thus began a new era of economic independence for Canada, the country, which for decades had been considered the junior partner of the United States, openly declared its right to its own path for the first time. This moment was a turning point, not only for Ottawa, but for the entire architecture of North American trade. Thus, the first and second stages of the conflict.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
From the introduction of tariffs to the formation of a response strategy showed how deeply intertwined the two economies are and how quickly the role of victim can be replaced by that of victor. The U.S. wanted to demonstrate its power, but ended up giving impetus to the transformation of an entire country. Canada, maintaining its cool calculation and reliance on domestic resources, managed to turn the crisis into an opportunity, an opportunity that subsequently changed its economic history. When the first effects of the American tariffs became apparent, the world expected that the Canadian economy would suffer the greatest losses. However, the opposite happened. The paradox of the trade war was that the tariffs designed to weaken Canada hit the U.S. itself first. The industrial interdependence of the two countries was so deep that any disruption in the supply chain
really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Instantly affected American factories. More than half of the parts used in the American auto industry were manufactured or assembled on Canadian territory. And when the tariffs took effect, this logistics system cracked. Production lines in Detroit and Illinois began to idle, and auto companies' import costs rose by an average of 12%. Articles with headlines such as "Tariffs That Hurt Their Own" began to appear in the American press. Against the backdrop of rising car prices within the U.S., sales in the mid-range segment fell by 9%, and consumers increasingly opted for used cars. At the same time, despite the difficulties, Canadian companies began to find new sales channels, especially in Asia and Europe, where interest in North American technologies in the field of environmentally friendly cars was growing rapidly. Several large European companies signed contracts to purchase Canadian battery modules and electric drive control systems. These successes were the result of Ottawa's early understanding that the key to survival was not fighting tariffs, but creating a new industrial logic. When internal disputes began in the U.S. about the advisability of a trade war, Canada was already laying the foundation for future technological leadership. The country saw the emergence of the first investment funds focused exclusively on the development of clean technologies and industrial robotization.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
At one of the government meetings, the idea of creating a new generation automotive cluster was discussed. Not a copy of American auto giants, but a network of high-tech enterprises working for both export and the domestic market. Particular attention was paid to energy independence. The Canadian Energy Commission prepared a strategy for the next decade, according to which the share of renewable sources in industrial consumption was to almost double. This decision had not only environmental, but also political significance. It reduced dependence on external supplies and made the country less vulnerable to economic pressure. As part of this strategy, construction began on new wind farms and solar stations in Ontario and Alberta. These projects not only provided electricity to local businesses, but also created thousands of new jobs, which is especially important against the backdrop of global instability. While Washington debated whether to soften its policy, Canada demonstrated confidence and thoughtfulness. And although the first few months seemed difficult, the results became clear. Domestic investment grew, unemployment in the industrial sector fell, and the trade balance gradually evened out. Reports from international agencies.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost. They don't allow our banks. Did you know that Canada does not allow banks to go in?
Noted that the Canadian economy had adapted to external pressure faster than expected. But the most unexpected result was the diplomatic effect. As the U.S. continued to increase tariff pressure, Canadian diplomacy began to act like a chessboard. Instead of loud statements and ultimatums, Ottawa built a network of bilateral agreements with key partners. One of the first areas of focus was cooperation with Asian countries, South Korea, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Canada saw these regions not just as markets, but as an opportunity to form new economic axes independent of American influence. Over the course of a year and a half, more than 10 agreements were signed, covering not only trade, but also technology exchange. In Europe, the reaction to U.S. tariff policy was equally cautious. Brussels saw how even Washington's close allies were being subjected to economic pressure, and so Canada became a natural partner for Europeans in matters of fair trade. Within the framework of the existing CETA agreement, negotiations began on additional preferences for Canadian companies working in the field of green technology. This was a serious signal. Ottawa was now seen not just as a supplier of raw materials, but as a high-tech economy with global ambitions. While the U.S. tried to hold on to its domestic markets, Canada filled the niche of a reliable, predictable partner. In Asia, it strengthened ties with Japan and Singapore.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
In Europe with Germany and France, and in Latin America with Chile and Colombia. These contacts not only compensated for the losses from U.S. tariffs, but also opened up access to new investments. Several large energy corporations announced plans to build lithium processing and battery component manufacturing plants on Canadian territory, seeing this as a long-term prospect. But perhaps the main achievement was the change in the perception of Canada itself. Whereas the country had previously been seen as a dependent link in the North American trade chain, it was now becoming an independent player capable of setting its own rules. A sense of confidence grew in Canadian society. The crisis, which began as a challenge, became a point of growth. Even among small businesses, a real boom began. Companies that had previously focused exclusively on the U.S. market began to seek customers in Europe and Asia, creating new logistics chains and implementing modern quality standards. At the same time, discontent was growing within the U.S. Automakers who had previously supported tariffs now demanded their abolition. Rising costs and supply problems hit the export opportunities of American companies. In some states, workers began protesting, accusing the government of destroying factories rather than saving them with the trade war. The paradox was that the attempt to strengthen the domestic market had turned into a factor in its weakening.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
For Canada, it was a moment of moral and economic victory. What began as a forced defense turned into an offensive. The country's economy became more flexible, more technologically advanced, and more sustainable. When the first economic consequences of the trade war became apparent, Canada had already moved from defense to offense. While its initial strategy was to minimize losses and reorient production, Ottawa now acted as a confident diplomatic player. Canadian representatives began working actively across the globe in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Their mission was crystal clear: to show that Canada no longer saw itself as a junior partner to the U.S. and was ready to build trade relations on its own terms. It was during this period that the country's new economic architecture began to take shape. Canadian diplomats used their long-standing image as a reliable mediator in international affairs to expand their influence in new markets. Negotiations were held in Singapore and Seoul on the creation of joint technology zones where innovative Canadian companies could gain access to Asian venture capital funds. In Europe, negotiations were underway to modernize CETA, a free trade agreement, and it was then that the idea of creating an Atlantic industrial corridor was first raised, which would allow for the exchange of technologies in the field of green energy and transportation systems.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
These initiatives not only strengthened Canada's position, but also prompted other countries to reconsider their dependence on the American market. At the same time, the Canadian government launched a large-scale campaign to promote national companies abroad. A special structure, similar to an economic diplomacy agency, was created to negotiate with foreign investors and offer tax incentives and infrastructure support for projects involving Canadian companies. In China, despite ongoing political differences, discussions began on the supply of Canadian technologies for environmentally friendly transport. And in India, an agreement was signed on the construction of research centers for battery technologies. It looked like a quiet revolution. A country that until recently had been dependent on supplies to a single market was now confidently establishing itself on several continents at once. At the diplomatic level, all this was accompanied by a clearly articulated message. Canada is ready to be a bridge between West and East, between between the U.S. and countries that are tired of trade ultimatums. This image proved unexpectedly attractive to many states. The European Parliament even began to say that Canada had occupied the niche of a moderate leader, capable of uniting countries around the ideas of sustainable development and fair trade. Foreign economic success became not just a tool for survival, but a new form of influence. These changes were no less noticeable within the country. The government actively promoted the concept of a new Canadian course, the essence of which was to diversify the economy and strengthen energy independence. Renewable energy subsidy programs underwent tremendous development. Wind power on the Atlantic coast and solar stations in Alberta began to generate more electricity than expected, and some of the surplus was supplied to the northern regions of the United States. This became a source of pride and a symbol of how external pressure can generate internal resilience. Over time, Canada's diplomatic offensive bore fruit.